The presenter is Professor Jenny Thomson from the Harvard Graduate School of Education in the United States, and one of the young and promising scientific experts of dyslexia at this forum. I am glad to welcome Professor Thomson to this session following our earlier cooperation in a cross-linguistic European study on the precursors of dyslexia. She will report for about 25 minutes about best practice for dyslexia across countries where English is the primary language of instruction. Professor Thomson, may I ask you to take the floor, please?
Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends, it is my privilege to be here today to report on best practice for dyslexia in English-speaking countries. First of all, I would like to thank the respondents of the survey in English, represented here on this map, and also thanked here individually. My talk today will follow the outline of the survey, as outlined here, and I will hopefully leave some time for questions as well. First of all, it is important to confirm the nature of the English language. English is an alphabetic system which relies on letter-sound correspondences. However, English is a deep orthography, which also means that those letter-sound correspondences are not one-to-one. This is due to both the rich heritage of influences that English has, for example, Old Norse, Anglo-French, Latin and Greek, but also due to the fact that while the sounds of English have gradually changed over time, the written language has not changed, and so there is a mismatch between the sounds and the spelling. This means that there can be many ways of spelling a single sound. For example, a long A sound can be represented by at least 8 different letter patterns, whilst conversely, a single letter can be pronounced multiple ways. For example, the letter A in the sentence, "He was carefully planting all the cabbages around the many potatoes." Interestingly, statistical analyses of English show that the most predictable level of word analysis is that of the onset rhyme. So within any syllable, there is the consonant and then the following vowel and coda, which is the rhyme. This means that although English does not seem consistent at the level of individual sounds and letters, at the level of larger chunks, there is consistency. However, because these patterns are less obvious and often require explicit teaching, this makes the task of reading and spelling in English difficult for any reader, and for children with dyslexia, especially more so. In terms of attitudes to literacy across the countries surveyed, it was generally agreed that literacy is indeed encouraged throughout society. Economic, social, and cultural activities are deeply dependent upon knowledge and information, which in turn are dependent upon literacy. However, it's important to note that in international surveys, for example, by the OECD, the PISA report, which is the Programme of International Student Assessment, where we see that access to education is equal, in a survey of 15-year-old students, girls are consistently outperforming boys in literacy. In trying to explain these differences, the PISA report, rather than placing responsibility in between-sex brain differences, places responsibility at the level of schools and societies, who, it quotes, "do not always succeed in fostering comparable levels of motivation, interest, or self-confidence in different areas among male and female students." This statistic is important for us to consider, especially given the male referral bias with dyslexia. also, despite equal opportunities in literacy as a sentiment, in a finite resource system, it is clear that there are inequalities across the lifespan. When children first enter school, clearly a key aim of education is to teach reading, and so resources and teacher education concentrate on that. However, even 2 to 3 years into a child's school career, if the child is not an independent reader, the resources of age and skill level appropriate materials, as well as skilled teachers, declines in terms of literacy instruction. The situation is even more inconsistent for adults, and in a major study in the US, at least 40% of working age adults were found to have literacy that was suboptimal for their family, work, and community experience. It's also important to note that even where resources are available, for example in the early grades, there is a constant tension between equality and efficiency. Should an education fund be used to help increase the standards across all children through a program for cross-classroom success, or should funds be used to help those children at the ends of the distribution? In countries such as the US, the legal system has been influential in ensuring help for the children who are struggling most at reading. Upon evaluation, legally mandated funds for one-to-one individualized help to help increase literacy skills are provided. There are also laws to help protect adults with dyslexia in the US and the UK. These laws help prevent discrimination in the workplace, although do not ensure or guarantee instructional provision at this age. Laws clearly rely on a discrete cutoff in order to determine eligibility, which brings us to thinking about dyslexia assessment. Across all the countries surveyed in English-speaking language, there was no country that had one single agreed-upon criteria for classifying dyslexia. One reason for this is that the research shows that indeed dyslexia is not one discrete entity. Although it is fairly agreed upon that the core deficit in dyslexia is one of phonology, even children's phonological difficulties occur on a continuum, and so clearly any criteria that we choose is going to be a necessarily arbitrary cutoff point. However, in terms of determining a child's profile, consensus came across that there were 3 key ingredients of assessment. Firstly, phonological processing, to include phonological awareness, phonological memory, and also rapid naming. Reading and spelling skills are obviously important to assess, both at the single word level, but also at the level of connected text, if possible. And also assessment of wider cognitive skills and a developmental history. This part of the assessment can ensure that the problem is not due to wider learning difficulties. A perhaps somewhat controversial way in which this information has been used to diagnose dyslexia right up until now is the discrepancy criteria. This criteria for diagnosing dyslexia stipulates a discrepancy must be present between a child's reading and spelling skills and their cognitive potential, typically measured by an IQ test. Although this is a very clear criterion, it is also controversial because it means that children may have to go undetected for many years until they reach a point at which this discrepancy has been reached. One potential solution to this problem is emerging in countries such as the US and the UK and is called response to intervention. In this way of assessing children, there is no need for an IQ discrepancy in order to diagnose a child with dyslexia, but rather you assess for the presence of a reading and spelling difficulty, and also look at the child's response to an intervention. If a child has not responded to a research-based intervention, then this is an indicator for a diagnosis. Although this criteria is useful in terms of allowing us earlier intervention, it is still problematic for a few reasons. Partly, by not having the discrepancy criteria, this means that the difference between general learning difficulties and specific learning difficulties is less clear-cut to determine. And there are also remaining questions about what is a good research-based intervention, how much responsiveness to an intervention is enough, among other questions. So in terms of assessment, I think across countries, we still haven't come up with an optimal solution. In terms of teaching methodologies, there was more of a consensus across countries. And I'm going to split this discussion into talking about the content and also the process. In terms of content, many reviews and meta-analyses, both across good practice for typically developing readers, as well as specialist teaching for children with dyslexia, there's a consensus that any program for beginning readers should include a strong phonetic component and be multisensory. Because of the agreed upon phonological deficit in dyslexia, this makes sense. A question does arise for older readers who are detected to have reading difficulties and whether such a strong phonological component is still as effective. While the research base in this area is still growing, it does seem that for older readers, a phonetic approach is also useful, but that this must be bolstered by an equal focus on fluency and comprehension skills, which are clearly crucial in the later years of academic success. I've just included a couple of hyperlinks here to a couple of these reviews about good practice for reading in the classroom in general. The National Reading Panel meta-analysis is useful in this regard, as well as a report that talks more specifically about intervention for dyslexia. As was said earlier, these slides will be available on the website later, as well as from this computer, and you can also email me. There will be quite a few hyperlinks. So thinking more about phonologically based programs, these are clearly nothing new, and in fact derived from principles derived in the 1920s and 30s by Orton, Gillingham, and Stillman. The IDA described multisensory phonetic teaching as simultaneously visual, auditory, and kinesthetic tactile to enhance memory and learning. In this way, multisensory phonics both enhances a child's phonetic skills, but can also use the child's strengths, perhaps in other modalities, to bolster these skills. In terms of learning more about research-proven phonics programs, I've included a few resources here. I particularly recommend the website of the International Dyslexia Association, and I've included here a link to a web page which contains a matrix of multisensory reading programs. It discusses both their research base, their emphases, and more information on how you can find out about the programs. This is a really useful resource. I've also included some other links which talk about phonics programs and their research base. And some further links here, both from the US and Canada. In terms of the process, from what we've just said, it's clear that a successful intervention for children with dyslexia must have at its core a phonetic and multisensory base. Also, to ensure success, it is important that any program have small scaffolded steps and also be cumulative and sequential. Once a child has obtained a certain skill, it is important to ensure automatization through consistent, regular practice and review. And at all stages of reading, it is crucial that teachers provide verbal modeling of the skills that they wish to instill in their students. In terms of a resource to learn more about process, I am recommending an article about a specialist school for dyslexia in the US, the Benchmark School. Although there are many examples of good specialist schools across English-speaking countries, the reason I have chosen this one is because the article highlighted here has a great amount of detail about the school's organization, its admissions policy, its staffing, the general school environment, the curricula, and the ethos. I think this is an excellent resource for anyone thinking about either a specialist school for dyslexia or best practice in general schools. The Benchmark article also highlights the importance of teacher knowledge for dyslexia. And so this is an area to which we now turn, and was an area in the surveys that came across as an area of need. Many classroom teachers reported feeling unsure about how best to detect children at risk of dyslexia and how to access further help. A useful resource in this regard is the Rose Report, recently published in the UK. I've included the link here and strongly recommend this report for its wider coverage of the issues around assessment and intervention in dyslexia. However, the report also talks about teacher training in a fair amount of detail, and I've summarized, the diagram here summarizes the different skills that the Rose Report talks about. He identifies 3 key levels of training. First of all, he talks about core skills which all classroom teachers should have. He recommends that all classroom teachers should at least know the risk signs of dyslexia and also who to access help from for further information. I've included here a link which summarizes the key risk signs of dyslexia in English. Rose recommends that knowing this information should be part of initial teacher education, as well as followed up by online professional development. He then also talks about teachers who have advanced skills and recommends that within every school there is at least one teacher who has the expertise to select literacy interventions and implement, monitor, and evaluate them. Finally, he recommends across schools there are specialist teachers who both train within different schools, monitor program usage, and also intervene at the level of individual students who are particularly struggling. The Rose Report also details in more depth the exact components of teacher knowledge at these different levels, and so I would recommend going to the report if you would like further information. As well as teacher knowledge, another important thing that came through in the surveys was the importance of teacher attitude. Many children with dyslexia will have experienced a lot of failure despite much effort in their school careers. And so teachers who are believing that progress is possible and celebrating that progress as it occurs is extremely powerful and really cannot be underestimated. Also important is teacher validation of the students' current learning styles and also helping them move towards more effective learning styles. It is also important to increase children's motivation through literacy materials and activities that connect to the students' interests or functional needs. And just to affirm, ensuring success is so important for this group. Creating achievable, mutually agreed upon learning goals to create a positive sense of self-efficacy increases the amount of future effort a student will be willing to expend in literacy-related tasks. Finally, a note on collaboration and dyslexia. Across the countries surveyed, there was an inconsistent level of cross-agency collaboration. And this tended to happen most consistently when legal restraints and legal systems were in place to ensure this collaboration in the role of evaluation and provision of services for individuals with dyslexia. In a multidisciplinary team where it was occurring, the most typical configuration was involving teachers, families, psychologists, and allied health professionals, as well as the individual with dyslexia. Despite the inconsistencies, what came across as true is that collaborative best practice works most effectively when there is an active nurturance of these relationships. So time spent together in joint goal setting and time actively allocated for this purpose. Also cited as important was a basic level of shared knowledge about dyslexia across professionals and collaborators, as well as ongoing progress checking to ensure that goals would be being met in an optimal manner. So to summarize, intensive multisensory systematics phonics instruction should be at the heart of dyslexia intervention in English-speaking countries. Early identification, as we heard earlier, is crucial, and teacher preparation should facilitate this. And finally, dyslexia can have serious effects on an individual's wider academic, social, and emotional development. So attainable goals and the expectation of success are key. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Thomson, and for keeping the time.